of Israel. Trust me, this is gonna break your heart. This is going to break you down, toss you on your way to Babylon. No one's gonna let you come in. Doors are fastened, windows are pinned. Keep your hands on that plow.
Are we always impoverished? Why are we in bad living conditions? Why are we the highest unemployed in the whole country? Nobody ever asked the question.
Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going deep into biblical history. We're going to be looking at the lineages of Noah's sons and their connection to the African diaspora. And we've got 2 PDF sources that trace family lines all through Scripture, especially Genesis and Exodus. And one of the things that's really fascinating about these sources is how they challenge the way that we think about Blackness and race, even within these familiar Bible stories.
Yeah, it's like they take those genealogical charts that you might have seen.
Right.
And they use those connections to really redefine racial identity in like a biblical context.
Yeah. Okay. So, everybody knows Noah, right? Noah and his sons.
Mm-hmm.
Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Yeah.
They're the ancestors of all of humankind, according to the Bible. But these sources really kind of take it a step further.
They do. They link Japheth to the Gentiles.
Okay.
So like Caucasians or Europeans as we know them today.
Got it.
Ham is the father of the Hamites, who they identify as Black people, specifically Africans.
Yeah.
And then you've got Shem, the father of the Shemites, which encompasses a range of groups. Israelites, Ishmaelites, Edomites, Midianites.
So it's like a massive family tree.
Absolutely.
With just branches extending across the entire globe.
Yeah.
And it gets even more interesting when you look at the specific descendants of Ham.
It does.
So let's dig into that a bit.
Okay, yeah. So the source really points to Cush, who they connect to, Ethiopia, Mizraim, associated with Egypt and Nubia.
Wow.
Phut, linked to Libya and West Africa. And then you've got Canaan, who they say fathered the people of Palestine. And what's really striking is how they're making these very deliberate connections between these descendants, their geographical locations, and it's all centered in Africa.
Which is, of course, a continent that is undeniably historically associated with Blackness.
Right.
And it really does make you kind of rethink those Sunday school images.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, when you see these maps
Yeah.
and these family trees that are outlined in these sources.
It kind of challenges those traditional depictions, doesn't it?
It does. And then they even have this this twist about the real Palestinians being Black descended from Canaan.
Yes.
They even distinguish them from modern-day Palestinians,
Right.
who they say are Arabs or Ishmaelites.
Yeah. It's almost like they're using lineage to make a statement about who has a claim to the land.
Right. It's fascinating. It's like somebody went through the Bible with a highlighter and was like, look, Black history is woven into this whole narrative.
That's a great way to put it.
And they don't stop there. They go on to claim that several other prominent figures from the Bible were also Black.
Yeah. They point to the Assyrians, who they believe are descended from Cush.
Right.
Hammurabi, the Babylonian lawgiver, is also identified as a Cushite. Even Goliath, the Philistine giant,
Oh, wow.
is said to be from Mizraiming. And of course, they emphasize the blackness of the Egyptians, even referring to them as Moors.
Wow.
It really challenges like the traditional imagery that we've come to associate with these figures.
Yeah, I mean, picturing Goliath as a black man definitely kind of changes things up a little bit.
Absolutely.
So this leads us to one of the most, I think, well-known stories in Genesis, the story of Joseph. You know, the one where he's sold into slavery by his brothers?
Oh, yeah, a story that resonates throughout history, even today.
Absolutely. And the source points out something that I think a lot of people may overlook, and that's that Joseph is initially sold to the Ishmaelites,
Okay.
the Arabs, who then sell him to the Egyptians.
Right.
And I think that adds another layer to the whole power dynamic,
Absolutely.
the historical relationship between these groups.
Yeah, and here's where the source makes a bold statement.
Okay.
They say, and I'm quoting here, Egyptians and Israelites are the same color, BLSK.
So they're really kind of going against the grain with that.
They are?
Because, a lot of times we see, these elaborate Hollywood movies that have white actors portraying Egyptians, and this source is saying, no,
Right.
they were black. And, we have to remember that Joseph rises to power in Egypt. He becomes second in command to Pharaoh himself.
Right.
He interprets those prophetic dreams and saves Egypt from famine.
And what's even more interesting is that he marries Beseneth, the daughter of an Egyptian priest.
So the mother of his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, was black, according to this interpretation.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you have that really dramatic moment when the famine forces Joseph's brothers to come to Egypt seeking help.
Right.
And the source points out that during that time, the Israelites and the Egyptians couldn't even be distinguished from each other.
It's almost like a visual clue, hinting at their shared ancestry.
Right. And they further support this by highlighting how the Israelites, before they were a fully formed nation, frequently married outside their lineage.
Exactly.
So their appearance wouldn't have been uniform.
Right. You wouldn't have had this one look that defined all Israelites.
Right. It's really interesting how they paint this picture
Absolutely.
of a much more diverse kind of, group of people.
They're pushing back against that very simplistic, often stereotypical image.
Yeah.
And so, as you can see, this source is really building a case for a very specific interpretation of racial identity within the Bible.
Right.
It's not just a random collection of stories,
Right.
but a deliberate re-examination of who these people were and how they relate to us today.
Yeah, and this is really just the beginning. There's so much more to unpack, especially when we get into the story of Moses.
Oh, yeah, that's where things get really interesting.
We'll be right back.
Okay.
So we've been tracing these lineages through the Bible, right? And looking at how the source redefines our understanding of some of these key figures as black. And, it really makes you reconsider everything you thought you knew, especially when we get to the story of Moses.
Moses, oh yeah, he's a fascinating case study because his story really highlights not only the source's claims about blackness, but also just the complexity's identity in that era.
Right. I mean, here's this baby, right?
Okay.
He's born during a time when the Pharaoh has decreed that all male Hebrew infants should be killed. Oh, wow.
Talk about a tense historical moment.
Absolutely.
And what's remarkable is that Moses, though raised by his Hebrew mother, is described as looking Egyptian.
Right.
And of course, according to the source, Egyptian equals black.
Right.
It makes you think about how visual cues played such a significant role in defining somebody's identity back then.
Oh, absolutely.
And, later on in the story, when Moses flees to Midian after killing the Egyptian slave master,
Yeah.
he meets those Midianite women at the well, right?
Yeah.
And they mistake him for an Egyptian.
Uh-huh.
And the source emphasizes that he's described as both black and wearing Egyptian clothing.
It's like they're deliberately highlighting this point,
Yeah.
that Moses, the liberator of the Israelites, was himself seen as a black man by those around him.
It adds a whole new dimension to that Exodus story, doesn't it?
It does.
And speaking of liberation, this brings us to another really fascinating element from the source, and that's the curses outlined in Deuteronomy 28. Ah, yes, the curses. This is where the source really starts to connect these ancient biblical events to the later experiences of the African diaspora.
Okay, so can you elaborate on that a bit for our listeners? What exactly are these curses, and why are they so central to the source's argument?
Sure. So Deuteronomy 28 basically lays out a series of blessings for the Israelites if they obey God's laws, and a series of curses if they disobey.
Okay.
The source really focuses on the curses, specifically the verses that describe the Israelites being scattered among nations, afflicted with all these hardships, and experiencing things like madness, blindness, and astonishment of heart.
Wow. So they're suggesting that these curses are key to understanding the historical suffering of people of African descent.
Exactly. They see those verses as foreshadowing events like the transatlantic slave trade and just the ongoing struggles that Black communities face around the world. But before we get too far ahead, there's another really powerful story that the source connects to these themes, the Passover.
Right.
That night, when the angel of death spared the firstborn sons of the Israelites because their doorposts were marked with lamb's blood.
A story that's celebrated even to this day.
Exactly. And the source takes that historical event and kind of imbues it with this deeper theological meaning. They connect the blood on the doorposts to the blood of Jesus. It's foreshadowing this concept of spiritual redemption through sacrifice.
That's really interesting. You know, it takes a familiar story and just adds this whole other layer of complexity to it.
It does.
And it also reminds us that even in the midst of these really intense events, there's this glimmer of hope and the promise of deliverance.
Absolutely.
Now, it's important to note that the source acknowledges the presence of a mixed multitude leaving Egypt with the Israelites.
Right.
It wasn't just this homogeneous group,
Right.
but a diverse collection of people, some Israelites and some not.
It challenges that simple us versus them narrative
Right.
that we often see in these historical accounts.
And this blurring of lines continues with another connection the source makes that really stood out to me.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the flight of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph into Egypt to escape King Herod.
Oh, right. Yeah, the story that's often depicted in those nativity scenes
Exactly.
and Christmas pageants.
But the source highlights how that escape was only possible because they were able to blend in blacks among other blacks.
Yeah, it's a powerful image.
It is.
And it reinforces that claim that Jesus, as an Israelite, would have also been black.
And this sets the stage for one of the most, I think, controversial claims that the source makes.
Okay.
And that's this idea that the people the world calls Jews today aren't actually the true descendants of the Israelites.
Okay, now that's where things get really interesting.
Right. We'll be back in a moment. So you were just saying that the people that we know as Jews today might not actually be the descendants of the Israelites. That's a pretty bold statement.
It is. According to the source, the people we call Jews today are actually the Edomites' descendants of Esau, Jacob's twin brother.
Okay.
They claim that this group assumed a Jewish identity over time, eventually replacing the true Israelites.
So not just a different branch of the family tree,
Right?
but a completely different lineage altogether.
Yeah.
That's a pretty significant shift in perspective. How does the source back up this claim?
Well, they point to a few key historical moments, starting with the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD.
Right.
This event marked the beginning of what they call the Times of the Gentiles, a period of exile and dispersion for the Israelites.
Right. That was a devastating event.
Oh, absolutely.
It's hard to imagine the impact that it had on the Israelites at the time.
And according to the source, the Edomites saw this as an opportunity.
Okay.
They argued that the Edomites had already converted to Judaism under the Maccabees centuries earlier and were already living in the land of Judah. So when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and scattered the Israelites, the Edomites were poised to step in and take over.
It's like a historical switcheroo.
Exactly.
One group fading into the background while another takes center stage.
And the source even claims that the true Edomites completely disappeared after 70 AD.
Oh, wow.
Which would have made it even easier for this new identity to take hold unchallenged.
But wouldn't there be historical records or evidence to contradict this? I mean, it seems like a pretty big claim to make without some pretty solid proof.
You're right to question it. And I think it's really important for our listeners to do their own research and kind of draw their own conclusions.
Right.
But the source goes on to connect this idea to modern-day conflicts, specifically those in the Middle East.
Are you talking about the statement by Menachem Begin, the former prime minister of Israel? The one where he declared that Judea and Samaria, also known as the West Bank, belongs to the Jews?
That's the one.
Okay.
The source interprets this statement through the lens of their claim about the Edomites, suggesting that modern-day Israel is built on a foundation of stolen identity.
Wow, that's a heavy accusation.
It is, and it's definitely going to spark debate and controversy.
Yeah.
But again, we're just exploring the ideas that are presented in the source material here, trying to understand the implications of these claims.
And the source doesn't stop with the Middle East. They also connect this concept of a dispersed Israel to the African diaspora.
Absolutely. They bring those verses from Deuteronomy 28 back into play. the ones about the curses.
Okay.
And highlight the passages about the Israelites being taken into captivity by ships and sold as bondmen and bondwomen.
It's hard not to see the parallels to the transatlantic slave trade. You know, when
Really?
you read those verses,
Yeah.
it's like they're saying that the historical suffering of Black people around the world can be traced back to these ancient biblical curses.
Exactly.
That's a powerful and potentially disturbing connection.
It is. And the source gets even more specific. They use examples like Africatown, Alabama,
Right.
a community founded by enslaved Africans from Dahomey, which is modern-day Benin.
A story of resilience and cultural survival
Oh, absolutely.
in the face of just unimaginable hardship.
But there's another layer to it.
Mm.
The source acknowledges Dahomey's role in the slave trade, pointing out that it was Hamites, Africans, who sold millions of Israelites to the Gentiles, the Europeans.
So they're not shying away from the complexities of history. They're acknowledging that oppression and exploitation can occur
Right.
within and between groups.
Exactly. They even go so far as to say that more Israelites have been killed by Hamites than by Gentiles, citing the Rwandan genocide as an example.
Mm.
In their interpretation, the Hutu, who are identified as Hamites, slaughtered the Tutsi, who they claim are Israelites.
It's a stark reminder that history is rarely black and white, that there are these multiple layers of complicity and victimhood.
It is.
And it really reinforces the source's assertion that 9 of the 12 tribes of Israel are dispersed among the Hamites and Ishmaelites,
Right.
primarily in Africa and the Middle East.
They use this to explain things like the high percentage of Black inmates in U.S. prisons, connecting it back to those curses in Deuteronomy.
Right.
They also delve into the stories of specific groups they believe are descended from the lost tribes of Israel, like the Beta Israel in Ethiopia and the Igbo people in Nigeria.
Wow. We have covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From the lineages of Noah's sons to the scattering of Israel and the complexities of the African diaspora,
Yeah.
these sources are presenting a really challenging and at times controversial reinterpretation of history.
It's definitely a lot to process.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember this is just one perspective.
Right.
But what I find so compelling about this deep dive is that it forces us to question our assumptions, to look at these familiar stories with fresh eyes,
Right.
and to consider the possibility that there might be more to history than we've been taught.
What resonates with you, listener? What challenges your existing beliefs? We really encourage you to dig deeper, do your own research, and come to your own conclusions.
And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts and reactions. Share them with us, and let's keep this conversation going.
Yeah, because ultimately, engaging with these complex and often uncomfortable aspects of history is how we learn and grow as individuals and as a society.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.